Hello, welcome to the Ride Around the Murray Festival's very first real-time online event as we work towards presenting a predominantly online festival program this year in 2 months' time in September. So I'm Anne-Marie, I'm the festival director, and I'm talking to you from here at the Albury Library Museum on Wiradjuri country, where we pay respect to Wiradjuri elders past, present and emerging. With me here in the virtual studio is Nick Gadd, when I press the right button, coming to you from his home in Melbourne on Wurundjeri land. Welcome, Nick.
Hi, Anne-Marie.
So Nick is the author of 2 novels and the forthcoming non-fiction book, Melbourne Circle, Walking, Memory and Loss, which is both a memoir and a chronicle of his Melbourne Circle project, in which he walked urban areas in a circle around Melbourne and documented in his Psychogeography blog of the same name. Nick's going to spend the next 40 or so minutes showing and telling us all about psychogeography and what that is. I'm really looking forward to that. Following that, he'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. And you can type your questions into the YouTube chat function anytime during the presentation. Just know that you do need to be logged into Google to post a question. So Nick, I'll pop back at the end when you're ready for some questions. And yeah, really looking forward to this. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. My name's Nick Gadd. I'm a novelist and an essayist. And a few years ago, I wrote a blog called Melbourne Circle, which described a walk around the whole of Melbourne in a big circle over 2 years. And today I'm going to talk to you about a topic which has a fancy name, but which is actually a concept that is quite easy to grasp. It's called psychogeography. And psychogeography is a term that was invented in the 1950s by a group of French thinkers called the Situationists. And it was about a new way of understanding the relationship between human beings and urban spaces. And as you might be able to guess, it's like a combination of psychology, which is, of course, about the human mind and human emotions, and geography, which is, of course, about place. So it's about the many different ways that the human mind and the human heart and a sense of place can intersect with each other. And if that sounds like a broad definition, well, it's meant to. Psychogeography has been used in many different ways by artists and writers over the last 50 or 60 years. So what I'm going to give you today is my personal version of it. There are many different versions of it. And really the best thing to take away from this presentation is the concept that psychogeography is about your own unique individual way of relating to a place. Now, the leader of the Situationists, who was a writer called Guy Debord, defined psychogeography as the study of the laws and effects of the geographical environment on the emotions and behavior of individuals. So that was his definition. It's not exactly the definition that I use. Psychogeography is not the same as local history, although I am interested in history. I'm not a historian. I'm not an expert on architecture or town planning or street art or geography or anything really. Although you will find bits of all of those things in my work. I'm a writer, and I'm interested in ways of responding to the environment around me. So what you're going to get is a really personal interpretation of what psychogeography is. Now, if you just bear with me for a second. I'm going to show you now some of the themes that are important in psychogeography. Anne-Marie, could you bring up the first slide, please? So here I've grouped together some of the key themes of psychogeography, which have been used by many different writers and artists over the years, and which are also important to my work. So psychogeography does depend on the practice of walking. This is important. Many writers and artists have done things with psychogeography, and they have differed widely, but they nearly always involve exploring on foot. But what kind of walking? Well, not just walking to the shops or walking your dog. That's not psychogeography. Rebecca Solnit, the Californian writer, has written, walking ideally is a state in which the mind, the body, and the world are aligned. So you're not just walking, you're paying attention as you go. You're looking and listening, the smells, the sounds, the feelings that you have as you pass through a particular place. Why does one spot make you feel a sense of happiness or anticipation? Another place fill you with a sense of boredom or melancholy? What creates the mood? What is your relationship to this place? This is attentive walking. The situationists referred to what in French is called the dérive, which in English means drifting. They used to drift through the city of Paris, trying to attune themselves to a deeper sense of place. So it's not about having any specific destination. In fact, it's better to start off not knowing where you are going to go or what you are going to see. Rebecca Solnit wrote a wonderful book called A Field Guide to Getting Lost, in which she wrote, the random, the unscreened, allows you to find what you didn't know you were looking for. So there has to be an element of randomness about it. Just be open to discoveries, whatever comes along. My method is just to wander around, and when I see something that appeals to me, I try to find out about it. And then I write about it. I try to find the stories behind it. It's not a systematic investigation. There is an element of randomness. What speaks to you in this place? What unexpected encounters can you have? A fundamental requirement is curiosity. Psychogeography is also about a personal response to place. What are the personal memories, the stories, the emotions that particular places have for you? In a sense, everyone lives in a different city because we all have a different experience of the city. Guy Debord, who's the French writer I mentioned before, said the secrets of the city are at a certain level decipherable, but the personal meaning they have is incommunicable. And, you know, I like that fact. There are certain things that we can explain. There are certain things that we cannot explain, and that's a starting point for the imagination. So psychogeography is also about uncovering the stories that are embedded in a place. We can think of a town or a city as having many layers, layers of time, layers of architecture, as well as all the people who have lived there at different stages of their lives and different stages of the past. We can imagine all these people. What traces have they left behind? I've lived in the western suburbs of Melbourne for more than 20 years, so that particular streetscape is one that appeals to me and which I know well. Anne-Marie, could we come back to me now, please? I don't know Wodonga at all, and because of the current situation, I haven't travelled up there for this festival. But I hope that after this presentation, you will start looking at your own streetscapes in a different way. And in the rest of this presentation, we're going to be looking at some examples of the kind of things that I'm fascinated by. We're going to be looking at some things which are called ghost signs, which are old examples of old signage. We're going to be looking at a bit of street art and some examples of urban change and decay. We'll be thinking about the kind of stories that these things suggest to us, the kind of emotions that they suggest to us. How do they make us feel? Most of the examples I'm going to be showing you come from Melbourne, because that's where I've lived for the last 30 years and where I've done most of my research. I had intended to come to Wodonga for the festival, but COVID has put paid to that. But I think that the examples I will give you today will hopefully at least give you some ideas of the kind of things that you might look for when you go out and explore your own streetscapes, and the kind of pleasures that psychogeography, that a walk through the streets can afford us. And if you happen to be a writer, you will also find that suburban landscapes and urban streetscapes offer many of the kind of hooks that we need to start engaging with our environment, and they give us things to write about. So it's a way of tapping into the many narratives of the city, whether you're in Melbourne or you're in Albury or Wodonga. And at this point, I'm sure you're wondering, well, what are we supposed to look for? Well, let me give you some ideas. These are some of the things that have fascinated me over the years. Anne-Marie, could you please bring up the slide? Ghost signs. A ghost sign is any old piece of signage for a business or a product or a person that does not exist anymore. Let me show you a few examples. Ghost signs can sometimes be revealed in the process of development. A building might be knocked down for reasons of redevelopment, and it may then expose a piece of old signage, which may be many decades old, even 100 years old. This is an example of what happened in Melbourne on Latrobe Street, when a building was knocked down and it revealed this old sign for a saw maker from, I think, the early 20th century. And that sign was then visible for a few weeks, and then that wall too was knocked down. Why do these signs fascinate me? Partly because they can be beautiful and evocative in themselves, but they're like windows back into the past, and they can reveal some of the layers of the city to us. On this wall in North Melbourne, there are 3 signs from different eras. If you look at the top right, you can see signage for Penfolds wine. Penfolds wine, of course, that's a brand that still exists today, but that sign is, well, quite a few decades old. The signs on this wall, by the way, were not always visible. For many years, they were obscured under a layer of newer paint. Then the owners of the building in the early 1990s removed that paint, and these signs were revealed underneath, and the owners decided to leave them visible, which is great. Take a look at the bottom right of this wall. You'll see a curious looking figure in silhouette. This is actually the figure of a monkey in a suit. And there's a slogan in blue letters, which you might be able to work out some of the words there. I'll tell you the whole slogan. It says, "Won't wash clothes, but will clean metal and woodwork well." This is an old advertising sign for a product called Monkey brand soap, which was an English product which was available in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And the logo of this brand was a monkey, a kind of monkey butler. And the sign still survives. It could be more than 100 years old. If you look at the top left of this wall, you'll see another sign. You might see a few letters there, a D, an M, an O, a large I and an N in white paint. That is underneath the Penfolds sign. And what that one actually says is Dr. Morse's Indian Root Pills. And that was a very popular brand, an American brand of patent medicine that was very popular in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Among other things, it was sold very widely during the flu epidemic. of 1919. So that sign could be easily 100 years old, Dr. Morse's Indian root pills. So on this wall, we see three really interesting signs, ghost signs from different eras, which are like windows back into the past. This is a sign which is quite close, or used to be quite close to me, and it says, ask for Ecks Lemonade, E-C-K-S Lemonade. Ecks Lemonade, of course, does not exist anymore. It was a brand that was made in Melbourne, a local brand. It was available in the mid-20th century. And so it's a product that it reminds us really of the days when soft drinks used to be made locally, when you would have a particular brand of local soft drink. These days, of course, we all tend to drink the same things all around the world. But this was a local brand that just existed in Melbourne, and the company is now long gone. And as a matter of fact, the sign has now gone as well, because the owner of the building decided to paint over it with thick black paint. So that lovely old sign has now gone. Here's a couple more. This is in North Melbourne. This building has an advertisement for The Age above its windows on the right. And above its windows on the left, it has some signage which is hard to read, but it says Wertheim. Wertheim was a company that made, among other things, sewing machines and, I believe, pianos. The signage is still there. This is a piece of, look at that beautiful pointing hand there. This is on a wall in South Melbourne. It's pointing to Macaulays furniture store. Macaulays furniture store has not been there for probably at least 50 years, but it used to be a major shop in South Melbourne. And the signage is still there, beautifully painted. Now, this signage comes from Mildura. The signage in a place can be revealing and unique of the local identity of the place. A few years ago, I was a writer in residence at the Writers' Festival in Mildura, which is a place, of course, famous for citrus, famous for its orchards, oranges and lemons. So the signage around that city is quite unique. Features lots of oranges and lemons and associated products like soft drinks. Some of the signage is quite beautiful. It's part of the local identity. Sometimes it's almost reminiscent of a Dutch still life painting. It's there as a kind of lasting tribute to the skill of signwriters. Not always treated with great respect. As you can see, this lemon signage, there should be more of those lemons to the left, but it's been cut in half by the owners of the building. Still a beautiful piece of work. This is also a Mildura sign. Cottee's, of course, is the drink company that makes a lot of products out of oranges and lemons. Sometimes an old sign can be the start of a story. And that was the case with this old sign, which appeared for a few months in Melbourne a few years ago, when a Victorian hotel was demolished, and this sign was revealed on the construction site. And it says, consult the celebrated specialist, Dr. King, MRCS, consultation free. The style of the lettering is late Victorian. That's our first clue. It also matches the age of the building which was demolished, which was an old Victorian hotel built in 1891. So we know that this sign predates the hotel, so it's around 1890. But who was Dr. King? I carried out some investigations via Trove, which is the website of the National Library of Australia, and I found similar newspaper advertisements placed by Dr. King in regional and suburban newspapers around about the year 1890. I looked in old street directories to track him down, and I discovered that he was quite an interesting fellow. His main practice was in Kyneton, But he was, what kind of a specialist was he, you may ask? Well, he was actually a medical clairvoyant. And according to his advertisements in the newspaper, all you had to do was send him a lock of your hair or a letter or one of your possessions, and he would diagnose you from a distance. And he would tell you what was wrong with you and then prescribe some medicine for you, which I suppose was how he made his money. Which sounds a fairly dubious practice, you may think. But in the 19th century, the medical profession was not regulated in Victoria. Anyone could call themselves a doctor. This guy was an MRCS, so he was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, which sounds okay, but that was the sort of base level medical qualification in those days. There were really no consistent standards. I wrote an essay about Dr. King, saying what I'd found out about him, and I was contacted by one of his descendants who told me more. Dr. King came from Ireland. He trained in Dublin. He came out to the gold towns of Victoria after the gold rush. He built up quite a successful practice. This sign, which appeared in Melbourne, was perhaps evidence of his attempt to build up a practice in Melbourne. So the ghost sign leads us back to stories of Victoria in the 1890s and the history of the medical profession. Anne-Marie, could we come back to me, please? You can read the full story of Dr. King on my website, Melbourne Circle, and the essay is called An Appointment with Dr. King. One thing I like about the story of Dr. King is that there are certain things that you can find out about him, certain facts that can be established, but there are lots of things that we just will never know about him. And that's where there's a space for the imagination, which appeals to me as a writer. That space for the unknown is part of the pleasure, I would suggest, of psychogeography. You can look at something and you can learn a bit of the history of it, but there's always things that you can't find out. And that's part of the pleasure of it, I think. There are many gaps. There are things that we just don't know. Ghost signs never tell us anything. Never tell us everything. They do tell us some things, but they don't tell us everything. Now I would like to move into the present day a little bit. It's not only old signs that interest me. I'm also interested in the kind of unofficial markings that people make to around their own neighborhoods. Think, for example, of street art, of graffiti, other kinds of odd markings. In art, they talk about found objects. In writing, we can talk about found texts, and it can be enjoyable and interesting to look for the kind of found texts that occur around our neighborhoods. One of the kind of found texts that I am interested in is homemade no parking signs. Anne-Marie, could you bring up the slides, please? I like to collect photos of homemade no parking signs. They show us something about people's desire to protect their own territory. It would be wrong to think that they are simply functional. The no parking sign is an opportunity for the city dweller to express themselves. In fact, each sign says something about the person who created it. And there are many differences in the wording, the design, and even the materials used, which convey something about the authors of these signs. A great range of mediums can be used. The third one here has been written with a texter on the top of a polystyrene box. The second one, the top right one, the creator has gone to some trouble, I think, to try to make it quite artistic, to make the lettering artistic, while others are more rough and ready. And there's sometimes quite a casual approach taken to spelling. Was the one on the left written by a child, we wonder? Sometimes the simple message, no parking, is enough. At other times, people feel the need to add further explanations. The top one here says private parking, and to emphasize the point, adds the words, not you. Whereas at the Mildura Club, the more formal language, no exceptions granted, appears. While the one on the third one here was outside an architecture firm, and it has a certain kind of designy feel to it, as if a no parking sign placed by an architecture firm needs to have a kind of aesthetic element to it. So what does each of these no parking signs say about its creator? What would your no parking sign look like? Can we come back to me, please, Anne-Marie? Now, another thing that is often of interest to psychogeographers is places that are abandoned, derelict. They are redolent with a sense of loss and speak to us of past lives. They linger on in parts of the city, largely forgotten. And everywhere has this. I'm sure Albury and Wodonga have similar places. Anne-Marie, could you bring up the slide again, please? I'm going to talk a little bit about derelict places. This is what remains of a clothing factory quite close to my house in Yarraville, in the western suburbs of Melbourne. Of course, we used to have many factories in the western suburbs of Melbourne. There still are a few, but a lot of them have gone. This particular one has been abandoned for more than 10 years. It's called Bradmill. I'm going to read a short excerpt from an essay which I wrote about this building. The essay is called A Landscape of Stories, and it was published in Griffith Review. Not far from my house stands a monument, the derelict Bradmill clothing factory. The company struggled through the 90s, some of our neighbours among its employees, but went into receivership in 2002 with the ultimate loss of 900 jobs. The site has been abandoned ever since. Every now and then I edge through one of the gaping holes in the fence and wander around. Industrial debris is everywhere. Pallets, rubble, bits of metal sheeting, chunks of machinery I can't identify. There are abandoned cars full of crap left to rust or set on fire. The factory is partly demolished, roofless and unwalled. What's left of the frame is a rusty skeleton, and the windows are broken teeth. When I first went in a couple of years ago, one of the admin offices was still furnished. Chairs, shelves, even the ring binders in which someone kept the accounts. I have a vision of a dutiful clerk on the final day, inking the last entry, closing the folder, leaving the office and turning out the lights. Today, everything has gone from these shattered halls, but I imagine the voices of garment workers, Greek, Macedonian, Serbian and Croatian, Italian and Chinese, Vietnamese and English. The only sound is the flutter of pigeons' wings in cavernous spaces, and my footsteps on the fissured concrete. Aerosol cans are scattered across the floors. The walls are a gallery of art and tags. The old warning signs are still legible. Danger, benzyl alcohol, highly inflammable. No naked flame or smoking within 20 feet. A painted hand points to the dye house. Another sign carries the warning, employees with chemicals in their eyes must wash at the eye wash station for 15 minutes. As is usually the fate of such locations, the site is slated to be a massive development. 1,000 new houses and a retail and leisure complex are supposed to be built here, including a fashion hub selling imported clothes. But the work has been held up by zoning disputes and commercial negotiations. Now the site stands at an intermediate point, neither one thing nor the other. Vegetation, ignoring the keep clear signs, clumps with impunity around doors, sidles up fire escapes, encircles rusty girders, and cracks the concrete floor. Rabbits skip around the dye house, foxes trot through the deserted offices. It doesn't take long for the non-human world to reassert itself. People forget, and to use the defining cliches of our time, move on. Quietly, without fuss, nature moves back. Now, so that's the Bradmill factory. I'm going to show you another building that is sort of derelict, but not quite. This one is in Footscray. Now, you might think this is not a particularly impressive building. You can see that at the ground floor, there's a number of small shops there, mainly fashion shops. And you can see from the signage on the top floor that it was a bingo hall, Fiesta Bingo, although quite a bit of the signage has fallen off. But before that, it had another purpose. It was actually the Grand Theatre, not very grand today, but it used to be the biggest and best cinema in Footscray, built in 1911, and it finally closed in the 1980s. I wrote a blog post about this building in Melbourne Circle. I even went inside and had a look around upstairs, where the cinema is long gone and is now being used as a place to store furniture. When I wrote that blog post, it received thousands of hits and a lot of comments. Why? Because cinemas are important places. Cinemas are worlds of the imagination. They're places where you can be carried off into another world. They may even be places where you fall in love. So people feel very emotionally attached to cinemas. This building, despite its unprepossessing appearance, holds a special place in the memories of many people. Now I'm going to take you around the back of the Grand Theatre, which has a big brick wall. And on the back of the Grand Theatre, you will find this. It's a giant paste-up of an artwork by a Melbourne street artist called Baby Gorilla. And this work is a paste-up. It's made of paper. So it's not permanent. It's not painted there. It will last for a few years and then it will get washed away by the rain and erosion and the weather. This is a very evocative image of love and impermanence. So it seems appropriate that it's found on the rear wall of the old cinema, which has transformed itself over the years. I've often noticed these two figures of a man and a woman in different places around Melbourne. Baby Gorilla has created artworks like this in many places around Melbourne, where you can sometimes find them high up on walls, hidden away down laneways. You'll look up and there they are, unexpectedly. A little discovery. I've seen them many times in different places and I've wondered about their story. Anne-Marie, could we come back to me for a minute? Now, one of the best pieces of advice I can give about doing urban walking is to look up. Often when we are walking around, we tend to just keep our eyes at ground level. But if you look up, you will often see something quite remarkable. I'm going to talk about one more building. This was a building that I saw on Chapel Street in Prahran. Anne-Marie, could we go to the slides again, please? The Lost Arcade. As I was walking down Chapel Street, which is a shopping strip in Melbourne, one day, I saw this building. And if you look at ground level, you can see it well. There's a branch of JB Hi-Fi there. And if you were just walking along shopping, you might just see that shop. But when you look up, you see something quite remarkable. It's quite a special building. It's got some remarkable features. Look at those arches, those columns, those balconies, the ornamentation. There's a couple of eagles with spread wings on the third story. But also the building is in a bit of a state of decay. It doesn't really look its best. And psychogeographers do tend to be interested in things that are a little bit decayed. This architectural style is known as Second Empire. It was popular in France in the late 19th century, and that's also when this was built, this building, around about 1890. And it was actually built as a shopping arcade. Paris was the epitome of shopping, of the sophisticated shopping city, the center of luxury and fashion. So this architecture was modeled on Paris, and yet here it is in the suburban Melbourne shopping strip. Here's a photograph that was taken quite early in the building's career, very soon after it was built. So you can see the horse and cart in front of it. You can also see that the building used to have quite an impressive roof, which has now been removed. And at ground level, we can see some quite interesting, hopefully you can see just around the front door, some quite interesting little, well, big sculptures on each side of the front door. And if they are still there today, they're hidden behind the signage that says JB. The building was opened in 1890, celebrated with a banquet organized by the owner. And originally the occupants included a Turkish baths, a billiard rooms, an oyster saloon, and a grand hotel. This is a ghost sign which still survives on the outside of the building, which tells us about one of the occupants, Miss Carroll, a costumière. That sounds Parisian, doesn't it? She was at number 9 in the arcade. However, the arcade did not have a very successful career. Now, this is probably what it was supposed to look like on the inside. This is not the Prahran Arcade. This is Royal Arcade in Melbourne. This was a very successful arcade, and it still is. But the Prahran Arcade did not go down this path. It was not successful. This was what the arcade looked like in the 1950s on the inside. Devoid of traffic, rather forlorn, forgotten and abandoned. Well, why did this happen? Well, after the arcade was opened in 1890, there was a major crash, a bust, an economic depression in Melbourne. So the person who opened the arcade, unfortunately, they opened it at exactly the wrong time. It was at the wrong place, the wrong time, and the arcade simply was not successful at all. So over the years, it had a different fate. It was occupied at various times by different community organizations, small businesses, a far cry from the glories of the Royal Arcade. The Prahran Arcade was a bit of a sad place. But it did have quite an interesting history. It became, in the late 60s and 70s, it became the home of Dan Murphy's, which occupied the whole ground floor. Dan Murphy actually ran the place himself in those days. He was establishing himself as a wine merchant. This was before he was a big Australian brand. I particularly like, in this old photograph, which I think is from the 70s, that sign that says, "Shoplifters, you are being covered. No excuses accepted." Dan obviously took a very hard line about shoplifting. In the 1970s to the 90s, the upper stories of the arcade took on another lease of life as the home of artists and musicians, including the artist Howard Arkley. There are some photographs that were taken by the National Trust in the 1980s, which convey a bit of the romance of the Prahran Arcade. So this is taken from on the upper stories. They have a certain kind of faded romantic glamour. So, viewed in that light, the arcade. Can we come back to me, please, Anne-Marie? Viewed in that light, the arcade is kind of tells a story. It's not just a weird anachronism on a shopping strip, although it is that. It's a place that kind of represents grand dreams and ambitions that have crumbled a bit into decay. But the place has still become significant in other ways. So how does it make us feel? Maybe it makes us think about decay, about loss, about hope, about change, about the unexpected twists and turns of fate. Maybe it suggests all of that. I have just about reached the end of my presentation. In a moment, there will be a bit of time for you to ask some questions. But I hope that what this has done is given you some ideas about some of the pleasures of walking in streetscapes and psychogeography. Every place is different, and it doesn't matter if your neighborhood in Albury or Wodonga or wherever you happen to be doesn't have a lot of weird old Victorian buildings or a lot of ghost signs. The practice of psychogeography is about observing whatever happens to be there. I mean, as you've seen, I also like no parking signs. It's about being curious and attentive and paying attention and being aware of the unique and strange things that can occur in your environment. So I do hope that you will take the opportunity when you can to go out into the streets and see what secrets are there to be discovered. Anne-Marie, if we could just bring up the screen again for a minute. This is my blog, melbournecircle.net. Please check it out. And there are lots more stories there of the kind of things I've been talking about today, and lots of more pictures of ghost signs and old buildings. And my book, Melbourne Circle, Walking, Memory and Loss, is coming out in October 2020. So with that, Anne-Marie, if we could come back to me, and if you'd like to come back in, perhaps we could do some questions.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, that was wonderful, Nick. It just really makes me realize how much I forget to look and be curious sometimes. And I think of all the amazing buildings we have here in Albury. You really do need to look up, as you said. Yeah, and then now I'm fascinated too about my fascination with wide open, flat, vast horizons. Something to explore there. We've got lots of questions. I'm going to read this big one first that that Roxanne has emailed us. I go walking in the bush or on the farm, reading the marks of what fires have been through, where rain has washed the soil, where lightning has struck a tree and the bark peels, signs of animals passing, seasonal changes, on the rare occasion, a sense of ghosts or presence of people past. Has there been study into psychogeography in country areas, or is that simply called spirit of place? Sense of place? What a poetic question.
Fantastic question, Roxanne. Yeah, thank you. There has been a lot of writing about country walking as well. I would particularly recommend a writer called Robert Macfarlane. You might have read his work already, who has written some wonderful stuff about walking in country areas, in England mainly. So it's a book called The Wild Places by Macfarlane. and the old ways in which he walked some of the oldest paths in England. And there's also a man called Roger Deakin who wrote a fantastic book about trees. And so, yes, most of what I've done has been in urban environments, but I'm absolutely, fascinated by what Roxanne has just written and in that question. And I would certainly recommend everybody checks out the work of Macfarlane and Roger Deakin.
Lots more questions here. Lots of comments thanking you for such a fascinating slideshow. All the stories your buildings explored were so interesting. Thank you for sharing. From Valerie. Just while you're talking about other writers, Sally asks, does the approach of the British psychogeographer Will Self influence your approach?
Yeah, I've read some of Will Self's work. Yeah, he has a particular style, and one of the things he did was I think he walked to. He decided to walk to Heathrow Airport once and wrote about his, like, everybody drives to airports, so he decided to walk to the airport. So it's like, walking through like the kind of places that you usually don't walk through. It's one of the things that Will Self does. And then he took a plane to New York and LaGuardia or JFK Airport, and then walked from JFK Airport to his hotel. And yes, I kind of like the idea of walking in places where you don't normally walk. And I've done a bit of that around Melbourne too, just walking in these places that are totally dominated by cars and think, well, what's it like to walk here? So yes, I think Will Self is an interesting writer. Yeah. I have read some of his stuff. But I suppose my work probably tends to delve a bit more back into history than his does. But like every kind of, there's so many ways of doing psychogeography, and just walking and observing. I mean, like Will Self is great at kind of observing the kind of things that you just don't normally observe. So thanks for the question. Yeah.
I totally resonate with your comment, Carolyn. This has been fascinating. I never knew I was a psychogeographer. Where was it Nick said he started to look to find the history of something? Was it a section of the National Library? Now, I think Rachel might have answered the question, so I'll just ask her question as well, Nick, and you can respond to both.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. A really inspiring presentation. You mentioned using Trove to help research ghost signs. Yeah. What other methods have you found useful to unearth histories, particularly untold ones?
Well, Trove is great, and anybody who's not used Trove, then just it's fantastic online resources of newspapers, books, all kinds of stuff, and it makes research a lot easier. Especially since I'm not a professional historian or anything like that, so I just kind of reach out and try and find something that will help. There's street directories. There's a publication called Sands and McDougall, which was an annual directory published by a Melbourne company from about 1870 through to about 1970. And every year that they would record basically every building and every homeowner and every business, not just in Melbourne, but in the whole of Victoria. And I think there was an equivalent in New South Wales as well that would have covered Albury. I can't remember the name of that one. But local history societies tend to be really good at that kind of thing. And so if I have a particular building I'm interested in, I will look it up in Sands and McDougall. Might have to go to my local library to do, or the State Library to do that. The State Library of Victoria has been fantastic for me. I've done a lot of research there. If you can't get to the State Library, then history societies often have amazing resources that you can use. I've also found the National Trust has been really helpful and has helped me with my inquiries and have let me look at their archives. So there are people out there who know a lot of stuff, and local historians are often very happy to share what they know. And it's amazing what you can find on the internet, of course, as well, as long as you're sort of a bit careful about, finding sites that are reliable. So that's those are the kind of resources that I've tended to use. And also, like through the blog, people have made comments. So a lot of my readers, if I write something like, for example, I wrote about the lost arcade of Chapel Street, got a lot of comments from people who said, yes, it used to be a Dan Murphy's, and people who had all these memories. So I kind of crowdsource information, I guess. Like people will get in touch and tell me things. Like that story about the Footscray cinema. Everybody's got a memory about going to the cinema. So I got all these comments about what people remembered. So that's another kind of good way of anecdotally finding stuff out.
Mim says, I've loved your talk. I started walking at the start of ISO in Healesville. Now I will walk differently thanks to you. And she's also wondering, do you have podcasts of your walks?
No, that's a nice idea though. I have not done podcasts, no. But maybe I should. Something to look at. Yeah, thanks for the suggestion.
Mim, you might start the Psychogeography podcasts.
Yeah.
Someone else has asked, do you ever catch suburban trains to spot signs you might like to research later? It can be a fascinating glimpse into many back streets.
Suburban train, yes, absolutely. Look, jumping on a train and going to a station that you don't know and just getting out and having a wander around is something that I have done. And yes, and it's just a fun thing to do on a weekend or something. Just pick out a random station, go there, jump on the train and go there and see what you find. There's always something.
So Nick, there's obviously a lot of people well, maybe not a lot, but you mentioned a few people who are writing about psychogeography. Are there other authors you might like to, because people seem to be really appreciating this information, maybe you could share?
Yeah, I can share some suggestions. So I'll just, if you could you share the screen again, please, Anne-Marie? There's a few things to read here. Rebecca Solnit, I definitely recommend her work to everybody. She's a Californian writer. Those two books, A Field Guide to Getting Lost is a wonderful book. Wanderlust is is a history of walking. Anybody who's interested in walking will love Wanderlust. There's an essay by Virginia Woolf, Street Haunting, a London Adventure, which I really recommend. You'll find it online quite easily. Vanessa Berry is a friend of mine. She's written a wonderful book about Sydney called Mirror Sydney, which is about Sydney psychogeography. Many people will know W.G. Sebald and his fantastic number of books, but especially The Rings of Saturn, which is, and Sebald was a German writer, but he lived in England for many years, and his book is about walking. It's about the past. It's about layers of time. It's just unique. The other writers that I mentioned before were Robert Macfarlane. And if you Google him, The Old Ways and Wild Places are great books of nature writing. And the other one I mentioned, I think, was Roger Deakin, who's the title of his book escapes me at the moment, but it's something to do with trees. So, the literature of walking is vast. There are many, many books about walking. But if you start with those, and if you look at Rebecca Solnit's Wanderlust and look at the bibliography in that book, there are thousands of other suggestions of great books about walking and writing. Will Self, somebody mentioned Will Self before, and Ian Sinclair is another one. So yeah, there are so many Walter Benjamin, a classic writer about Paris. So yeah, we can come back to me now if you like.
And soon Melbourne Circle will be added to that list.
Melbourne Circle will be added to that list, yeah. So the book's called Melbourne Circle, Walking, Memory and Loss, to be published by Australian Scholarly Publishing around about October this year.
And you'll be back with us in 2 weeks' time to run a workshop on this, a writing workshop on psychogeography for anyone who's interested, and particularly local people who are interested.
Yeah, so that's going to be for writers. So it's if you're any kind of writer, whether, you know, poet, memoir, fiction, whatever, this workshop is for you. It's about the way that place can be a starting point for writing in the kind of ways that I've been talking about. So not just setting, it's also about mood, you know, it's about stories, it's about all of the stuff that we've covered today. So yes, that will be, I'm really looking forward to leading that workshop. And yeah, anybody, writers of all levels of experience are welcome. So that's on the 12th of July.
Yep, Sunday fortnight on Zoom, 10 till 12, and people can book for that via the WAM website. And that is targeted to people in the local region, and there is space there. If you're not local and you're interested in the workshop, you can go on a waiting list, and if there's space, we'll let you know, or if there's lots of you, we'll talk Nick into running another one.
Happily.
And
I'll be back later in the year to talk about Death of a Typographer.
Death of a Typographer, which also goes into your, what shall we say, passion, fascination, obsession with signage.
Yeah, signage.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to that. I loved that novel. It's a cracking, funny crime novel, really. So yeah, looking forward to you talking about that.
Me too.
That will be on the weekend of the 12th and 13th of September, and there'll be more details about WAM itself once we've launched our program on the 30th of July. So sign up to our website sign up for our e-news to be kept in the loop of that. And what else? I think that's it for the morning. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us this morning, and thanks so much, Nick.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to everybody who's been watching this, and thank you for those great questions. And it's been a great pleasure.
Great. All right. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye.
See you, Nick.
See ya.